In a small town surrounded by quiet streets and modest houses, there lived a young girl who often went unnoticed. She had soft brown hair that fell to her shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold more thoughts than she could speak. Her family was simple, not rich but not struggling too badly either, though every little expense had to be carefully considered. Life moved slowly in the town, and the people in it often paid little attention to those who were quiet and shy. She had always felt that she blended into the background, like a shadow that no one truly saw. The girl spent most of her days at school and at home, carrying out the usual routines that filled a quiet life. She did her homework carefully, helped around the house when she could, and tried to keep out of trouble. But there was a side of her that most people never knew, a side that was full of dreams, feelings, and music. She had grown up with a piano in her home, a slightly worn instrument that had once belonged to her grandmother. It stood in the corner of the living room, polished but with a few keys that stuck occasionally, reminding everyone that it had lived a long life. From the moment she could remember, she had been drawn to that piano. There was something magical about the way her fingers could touch the keys and produce sounds that were gentle, soft, and sometimes powerful. She would sit for hours in the quiet of the evenings, letting her hands move as if they had a mind of their own. No one ever asked her to play, and no one ever listened closely, but it didn't matter. Music had become her world, a place where she felt understood even when words failed her. Her family, though loving, did not always notice how much she loved music. They saw her sitting at the piano sometimes, but they thought of it as a hobby, a way to keep her busy. Her mother often called her for chores or to help with errands, and her father would ask her to run small tasks. But she always returned to the piano when she could, and each time she touched the keys, she felt a sense of peace that nothing else could give her. It was like stepping into a place where she belonged, a place where the noise of the world faded away. At school, she was quiet and polite. She didn't seek attention, and she didn't have many friends. Some students would tease her gently for being shy, saying she was too serious or too reserved. Others simply ignored her, focusing on the louder, more outgoing kids. She didn't mind too much. It hurt sometimes, of course, but she had learned to find comfort elsewhere. Her solace was always in the music she played when no one was watching. Even in the middle of a noisy classroom or a bustling playground, she could imagine herself at the piano, fingers dancing over the keys, creating melodies that no one else could hear but her. On weekends, when the house was quieter and the town felt almost asleep under the soft sunlight, she would sit by the piano for long stretches. Sometimes she played songs she had heard on the radio or learned from old music books. Other times she let her imagination guide her fingers, creating tunes that seemed to flow directly from her heart. There was a freedom in this, a way to express everything she could not say with words. Happiness, sadness, hope, and fear, all of it could be poured into the music. She had a small notebook where she scribbled ideas for songs, little notes and melodies that came to her in bursts of inspiration. Often she would hum a tune softly, then run to the piano to try to capture it. The sound of the keys under her fingertips was comforting, like a friend who understood her completely. And even when mistakes happened, when a wrong note slipped in, she never gave up. She would laugh softly at herself and try again, because for her, music was not about perfection. It was about feeling, about connection, about expressing a part of herself that could not exist in silence. Her parents sometimes wondered about the time she spent at the piano. They didn't discourage her, but they didn't fully understand either. They encouraged her to study hard, to prepare for exams, and to focus on practical things that could help her in life. They would say, "It's nice you like music, but remember, studies are important too." She would nod politely, knowing they meant well, but inside, she felt the music calling her back. No exam, no homework, no chore could replace the feeling she got when she let her fingers glide across the keys. Even her friends at school knew little about her musical world. She rarely spoke about it, partly because she didn't want to sound boastful, partly because she wasn't sure anyone would care. Sometimes she would play a few notes in the music class and the teacher would smile and nod, but it was just a small acknowledgement. It wasn't until she played alone in her room or at the piano at home that she truly felt alive. That was when she discovered the power of her own hands, the way the music could carry her away from worry, loneliness, and doubt. The town itself was quiet, with soft streets lined by trees that whispered in the wind. On evenings when the sky turned pink and the world seemed to slow down, She would sit by the window looking out at the horizon while her fingers found the keys. Sometimes the sound of her playing drifted outside, catching the attention of neighbors who paused for a moment to listen. Some would smile and nod, recognizing the beauty even if they didn't fully understand it. For the girl, this was a tiny taste of what it might feel like to be truly heard, to have her music touch someone else. She had moments when she wondered if she would ever be recognized for her gift. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed in, she would imagine standing on a stage with people listening, really listening to the music that came from her heart. It seemed like a distant dream, almost impossible in a town where everyone was busy with their own lives. Yet she could not stop herself from imagining it. The thought gave her hope, a reason to keep practicing, to keep believing in the unseen power of her music. Her grandmother, who had passed away when she was very young, had been the first person to notice her talent. She had sat beside the girl at the piano, gently guiding her small hands, telling her that music could speak when words failed. Those moments remained in her memory like a warm light. Even though her grandmother was gone, the lessons and encouragement lingered, shaping the way she approached each note, each melody. It was a reminder that the gift she had was not just a skill. It was something sacred, something meant to be shared. Even in the hardest moments, when the world seemed gray and unkind, the piano was there. It never judged her, never dismissed her, and never asked for anything in return. She would close her eyes and let her fingers tell the story she could not speak. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she laughed, and sometimes she simply sat in silence listening to the echo of the keys. Each sound was a reassurance, a small reminder that she was capable, that she mattered, and that the world held room for her in ways that words alone could not convey. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the girl continued to grow, learning a little more about herself through every song she played. Life in the small town remained quiet and unassuming, and most people still passed her by without noticing. But inside she was changing. With every note, every melody, every quiet practice session, she built a world of her own making, a world where she could feel free, where her spirit could soar, and where she could believe that one day, her music might reach ears that truly needed to hear it. She was still a quiet girl in a quiet town, but when her fingers touched the keys, she was something extraordinary. Time seemed to pause, worries faded, and for a brief moment the whole world could exist in the music she created. And in that magic she found herself fully and completely ready for the life that was waiting for her beyond the small streets and modest houses she had always known. As she grew older, life became a little heavier for the girl. Schoolwork seemed to pile up, family responsibilities increased, and the quiet town, which once felt comforting, sometimes seemed limiting. Her days were full of routines: morning classes, lunch, chores at home, homework late into the night. There were times when she felt invisible, walking through crowded hallways where other students laughed and shared their stories while she stayed in the background. She watched them from a distance, wondering if she would ever belong in that world. And sometimes she wished she could disappear completely, blending even more into the walls of her quiet life. The piano, however, was always there. When the weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders, she would slip away to the living room, sit on the worn bench, and let her fingers wander over the keys. The music became a friend she could rely on, a companion who never judged her or asked for explanations. Sometimes she would play slowly, letting each note linger, filling the room with a softness that seemed to ease her worries. Other times she played fast, letting the rhythm of her hands chase away tension, almost like running without moving her feet. Music was the one place where she could breathe fully, where she could be herself without fear of criticism or misunderstanding. But the world outside her music was not always kind. Her classmates often didn't understand her silence, and some even teased her gently, thinking it was harmless fun. They didn't see the depth of her thoughts, the way her mind was always full of melodies and rhythms that no one else could hear. Teachers were polite, but they usually moved on quickly, focusing on students who spoke louder and performed better in tests. Even at home, though her parents loved her dearly, they didn't always have the time or understanding to notice how much she lived for her music. They encouraged her to study, to focus on practical goals, reminding her that life was not only about dreams and melodies. She nodded and tried to obey, but the pull of the piano was too strong. She could not ignore it, and she did not want to. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at school, she returned home feeling tired and small. Her shoulders ached from carrying books and expectations, and her mind was heavy with doubts. She set her bag down quietly and walked toward the piano, her fingers already itching to touch the keys. As soon as she pressed down on the first note, a warmth spread through her chest. The music wrapped around her like a blanket, softening the edges of her worries. She played for hours, letting her emotions guide her hands. Sadness, frustration, fear, all of it came out in the music. And when she finally stopped, she felt lighter, as if the notes themselves had lifted the weight she had carried all day. Despite these private moments of relief, she longed for someone to hear her, to understand what she could express through music. She imagined standing on a small stage, maybe at a school recital or a local event, and playing for people who truly listened. She wondered if anyone would be moved, if they would see past her quiet exterior and recognize the depth within her. But the fear of failure held her back. What if they laughed? What if they ignored her? These questions whispered in her mind, making her hesitate to share her gift with the world. Financial pressures at home made her dream feel even more distant. Her parents had to budget carefully, and lessons with a professional teacher or buying new sheet music were often considered luxuries they could not afford. The girl sometimes watched her friends with envy, knowing that some of them had private lessons, grand pianos, or parents who could easily support their hobbies. She felt the sting of inequality quietly, but she refused to let it extinguish her passion. She practiced every day, making the best of what she had, and she discovered that even with limited resources, she could create beauty. She began to experiment with composing her own melodies. At first, they were simple, small fragments of songs that she scribbled into a notebook. Sometimes she would play the melody over and over, adjusting the notes, trying to capture the feeling exactly as it came to her. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was also exciting. She felt like a painter creating a masterpiece using sound instead of colors. Each small success, each moment when a melody turned out exactly as she imagined, filled her with pride and determination. Her love for music became a kind of secret rebellion against a world that did not always recognize her. Every note she played was a reminder that she had something special, something that could not be taken away by judgment or circumstance. Even when others overlooked her, she could see the strength in herself, and the piano became a mirror reflecting her inner courage. She realized that the music was not just for her own escape. It was a statement of who she was and what she could offer to the world. One evening, the town hosted a small community gathering in the local hall. She had been invited to attend with her family, but no one expected her to perform. The room was filled with laughter, chatter, and the scent of fresh-baked bread. People mingled, sharing stories of their week and enjoying the comfort of familiar faces. The girl felt a mixture of curiosity and nervousness as she looked around. She wanted to belong, to be part of the conversation, but she found herself slipping quietly into a corner, hands clasped, heart pounding with a quiet longing. A friendly neighbor noticed her standing alone and asked if she would like to play something on the small piano in the corner of the hall. Her heart leapt. She hesitated, thinking about the eyes that might watch her, the judgment that might follow. But then she remembered the joy of music, the way it had always been her companion, and she nodded. Slowly, she walked to the piano, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the keys. She closed her eyes and let the music flow. As soon as the first notes rang out, a hush fell over the room. The chatter stopped and people turned to listen. Her fingers moved with a confidence she had never felt in front of others, as if the piano itself guided her. Each note carried her emotions, telling a story of hope, struggle, and quiet resilience. She could feel the hearts of those around her responding, their eyes softening, some even tearing up. For the first time, she realized the power of her gift, the way music could connect people and convey what words often could not. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. It was polite at first, but soon it became genuine, full of warmth and admiration. The girl felt a rush of pride and disbelief. People were noticing her, truly noticing her in a way she had never experienced before. She smiled shyly, cheeks flushed, heart pounding with happiness and relief. This single moment, small as it might seem to some, marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She had faced her fears, shared her talent, and discovered that her music could touch others in ways she had only dreamed of. After the event, neighbors and friends came up to her, praising her performance and asking her to play again sometime. She listened with quiet joy, realizing that the world might not always recognize her in everyday life. But there were moments when her talent could shine through. She felt a mixture of pride and humility, knowing that she still had much to learn but also understanding that her gift was real and valuable. The experience lit a spark in her heart, giving her courage to continue pursuing her music no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. Back at home, she sat by the piano that night and reflected on the day. She realized that sharing her music brought a different kind of fulfillment, a connection that practice alone could not provide. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. She promised herself that she would not hide her talent, that she would continue to play, to compose, and to share her gift with the world, one note at a time. The doubts and challenges were still there, but they felt lighter, less intimidating. She understood that her journey would be difficult, but the reward, the joy of music, the hearts she could touch, was worth every struggle. In the weeks that followed, she found herself practicing with new energy and purpose. Every time her fingers touched the keys, she remembered the faces of those who had listened, the warmth in their eyes, and the way the room had gone silent to honor her music. That memory became a guiding light, a motivation to keep improving and to trust in her abilities. Slowly, she began to imagine a future where her music could reach even more people, where the quiet girl from a small town could make a mark in a world that often overlooked those who did not shout the loudest. Through all the struggles, the doubts and the moments of loneliness, one thing remained constant: her love for music. It was a source of strength, a reminder of who she was and a promise of what she could become. The piano was more than an instrument, it was a companion, a confidant, and a doorway to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. And as she sat in the quiet of her room, letting her fingers dance across the keys, she felt a sense of purpose and hope that carried her through the days, gently guiding her toward the life she was meant to create. The following months were full of practice, small performances, and quiet moments of self-discovery. After the first time she played at the community event, the girl began to understand that music was more than a private escape. It was a way to reach people, to make them feel, to touch their hearts in a way that words could not. The thought both thrilled and scared her. She loved the feeling, but the pressure of performing in front of others made her nervous. Her fingers had always known how to move across the keys in the privacy of her home, but now they had to dance under the gaze of other eyes, eyes that could judge or praise, eyes that could change how she felt about herself. Despite her fears, she started accepting small invitations to play at local gatherings. Each event was different. Sometimes it was a family celebration with familiar faces, sometimes a school function where she knew almost no one. The first few times her hands shook slightly, and her heart raced as she sat on the bench waiting for the first note to arrive. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let her fingers find their way. Every performance became a learning experience, teaching her how to channel nervous energy into passion, how to tell a story with sound, and how to connect with the people who listened. At first, the audience seemed polite and distant. They clapped when she finished, smiled, and moved on. But gradually, she began to notice something remarkable. People were changing as she played. Some would lean forward, their faces softening. Others would close their eyes, as if trying to remember something they had lost. And sometimes someone would wipe away a tear. She started to understand that music was not just about the notes. It was about the emotions hidden between them, the unspoken feelings that everyone carried inside. She had a power she had never realized, a power to awaken hearts and touch souls, and it filled her with a quiet, growing confidence. Not everything was easy. There were days when she felt exhausted, when her fingers hurt from long practice sessions, or when school and family duties left her drained. Sometimes she questioned whether it was worth it. Other kids her age seemed carefree, laughing and talking about games and friends, while she spent her evenings chasing melodies and rhythms that sometimes seemed elusive. She missed being like them, blending in without expectations or responsibilities. Yet whenever she sat at the piano and let her hands move, the world fell away. In those moments, nothing else mattered. She felt alive, purposeful, and understood in a way she rarely experienced anywhere else. One afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation from the town's cultural club. They were planning a small concert to showcase local talents, and someone had mentioned her name. She was both excited and terrified. Performing in a hall filled with strangers was far different from the intimate gatherings she had experienced before. Doubts crept into her mind. What if I make a mistake? What if they don't like me? What if I can't reach them with my music? She spent days practicing, refining her pieces, adjusting the tempo, perfecting transitions, and memorizing every note. Each practice was a step toward conquering fear. But even with preparation, the anxiety lingered like a shadow. The day of the concert arrived, and she entered the hall, feeling the weight of anticipation. The room was larger than anything she had performed in before. Chairs were set in rows, and the stage, though modest, felt monumental. The lights were bright, and the murmur of conversation made her stomach flutter. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in her chest. She wondered if she could do it, if her music would still flow freely when she was no longer alone in a small living room. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. But she remembered all the quiet evenings spent practicing, all the melodies scribbled in her notebook, and all the times she had imagined this moment. When it was her turn, she stepped onto the stage. She could see the audience, a mix of familiar and unknown faces, their eyes on her, waiting. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and let her fingers touch the keys. Instantly, everything changed. The nervousness melted away, replaced by a flow of music that came from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind. Each note seemed to tell a story, her story, a story of quiet perseverance, dreams held tightly, and a longing to be understood. The hall was silent, every person listening intently, caught in the rhythm and melody. For those moments, time seemed to stop. She was not a shy, unnoticed girl anymore. She was a storyteller, a guide, a bridge between the music and the hearts that received it. The performance was a revelation. She played with emotion, skill, and a quiet confidence that surprised even her. As she moved from one piece to the next, she noticed tears glistening in the eyes of some listeners. Smiles formed on faces that had seemed distant moments ago. People leaned forward, hung on every note, as if the music itself was carrying them away from their everyday worries. She realized then that her music had power. It could make people feel joy, sorrow, hope, or comfort, all through a series of notes pressed in perfect harmony. And in that moment, she felt something she had never felt before, the true meaning of her gift. When the last note faded into silence, the hall erupted with applause. It was loud and sincere, filled with warmth and admiration. She stood for a moment, heart racing, tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the response. She had shared her soul through music, and it had been received. People approached her afterward, expressing amazement and gratitude, asking her to play again, complimenting her skill and the emotion she conveyed. For the first time, she felt visible in a way that went beyond polite recognition. Her talent had made a difference, even if just for a moment, in the hearts of those who listened. Returning home that evening, she sat at her piano and reflected on everything that had happened. She realized that performing was not just about being seen. It was about connection. Music had the power to break barriers, to create understanding, and to touch lives in ways that words could not. The experience filled her with both humility and determination. She understood that she still had much to learn, many pieces to master, and many performances to experience. But she also knew that her music mattered. It had purpose, and it had meaning beyond the private comfort of her room. In the days that followed, she found herself practicing with renewed energy. Every note she played reminded her of the faces she had seen, the emotions she had witnessed, and the hearts she had reached. She started experimenting more boldly with composition, blending melodies she had learned with her own original ideas. Each new creation was a small triumph, a testament to her growing skill and confidence. She discovered that music could be a language not just for herself, but for everyone willing to listen, and that realization fueled her passion even more. Not everyone understood the change in her. Some classmates still teased or ignored her, and life continued to bring its usual challenges and responsibilities. But she no longer let that discourage her. She had experienced a moment of recognition, and it had opened a door she could never close. She knew her journey would be filled with obstacles, moments of doubt, and setbacks, but she also knew that her dedication, her love for music, and her willingness to share it could carry her forward. Slowly, opportunities began to grow. A music teacher in town offered her occasional lessons after seeing her perform, impressed by her natural talent. Invitations to play at local events became more frequent. Each performance, no matter how small, added to her confidence, refining her skills and teaching her how to manage nerves, connect with her audience, and communicate emotions through sound. She began to see that the world was not closed to her, that it had room for her quiet strength and her extraordinary gift. And that realization was both empowering and motivating. Even in private moments, she began to notice subtle changes in herself. She walked a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and carried herself with a quiet sense of purpose. She realized that music had not only opened doors for her in the world, but also helped her understand herself better. The shy girl who had once faded into the background now had a voice, a presence, and a talent that could no longer be ignored. And she cherished it, knowing that every note she played was a step toward a future that, while uncertain, was filled with possibility. The power of the piano continued to shape her life. She experimented with different styles, learned to improvise, and developed her own unique sound. The music became a way to process emotions, celebrate victories, and navigate challenges. She also started noticing the small ways her gift touched others. How a simple melody could bring a smile. How a familiar tune could comfort someone. How a heartfelt composition could make someone feel less alone. The realization that her music could have such an impact filled her with a sense of responsibility and purpose she had never felt before. By the end of this period, she understood that her life had changed. The girl who once felt invisible and unsure now had a place in the world through her music. She knew that the journey ahead would require courage, practice, and perseverance, but she was ready. Each time her fingers touched the keys, she was reminded of her potential, the magic within her, and the joy of sharing it with others. And she knew deep in her heart that this was only the beginning of a journey that could take her farther than she had ever imagined, all because she had dared to let her music be heard. As time passed, the girl's life became a delicate balance of school, family, and music. Each day brought new challenges, and she quickly learned that talent alone was not enough. She needed discipline, persistence, and resilience. The lessons she had taken after her initial performances became more frequent and intense. Her teacher guided her through complex compositions, showing her techniques to improve speed, control, and expression. Sometimes she struggled, feeling her fingers stiff and clumsy, and there were days when frustration threatened to overpower her. But she had learned to push through, to treat each mistake as a step forward rather than a failure. Every challenge she faced was another opportunity to grow. Her family continued to be supportive, but their lives were busy, and she often found herself managing her own schedule. There were moments when she had to skip social gatherings, spend long hours alone practicing, and sacrifice leisure to perfect her music. Sometimes she wondered if it was too much, if the cost of pursuing her dreams was higher than she could afford. But when she sat at the piano, all doubts faded. The music reminded her why she was willing to work so hard, why she was willing to endure tired fingers, late nights, and sacrifices. The piano was more than an instrument, it was a companion, a teacher, and a sanctuary. Despite her growing skill, the path forward was not always smooth. She encountered moments of doubt, criticism, and competition. Other young musicians in her town and at her school sometimes outperformed her, and she could not ignore the sting of comparison. At first, it shook her confidence. Why could they play faster? Why could they perform more confidently in front of audiences? But gradually, she began to understand that her journey was unique. Music was not a race, and her worth was not measured by someone else's performance. She began to embrace her own style, her own emotions, and her own voice, realizing that what she offered was different and that difference was powerful. Opportunities to perform continued to increase. She was invited to local events, small competitions, and school recitals. Each performance taught her something new. Sometimes the audience was unresponsive or distracted, and she had to learn to keep her focus and pour her heart into the music regardless. Other times, the audience's reaction would surprise her, filling her with warmth, pride, and a deep sense of purpose. She began to see that performing was not just about playing the right notes. It was about communication, emotion, and connection. Each person listening had their own story, and her music could touch it in ways words could not. One evening, she was invited to perform at a slightly larger event in a neighboring town. The hall was bigger and the crowd more diverse. She felt both excitement and anxiety. The stakes were higher, and the possibility of mistakes loomed over her. As she approached the piano, she felt the familiar tremor of nervousness. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, everything else faded. The music became her guide, her anchor, and her voice. The notes flowed naturally, carrying her emotions and telling stories of perseverance, hope, and quiet strength. The audience responded with awe, and she realized that the connection she created with music transcended words age, and background. Over time, her music began to reflect her life more deeply. She composed pieces that captured her experiences, her struggles, and her triumphs. The melodies were filled with longing, joy, sadness, and hope, echoing the emotions she felt most deeply. Friends, neighbors, and teachers began to notice her originality. They complimented not just her technical ability, but the way her music conveyed feelings. People started to approach her for advice, for guidance, and sometimes simply to listen. She realized that her gift was not only for her own expression, but also for sharing, teaching, and inspiring others. Despite the growing recognition, challenges remained. Financial constraints made some opportunities difficult to pursue, and balancing schoolwork with practice required constant effort. There were days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, and moments when her own self-doubt crept in. Yet she persisted, knowing that every hour at the piano, every struggle, and every small victory brought her closer to the musician she wanted to become. She learned to celebrate small achievements, to acknowledge progress, and to be patient with herself. Through all of this, she also discovered the importance of humility and gratitude. She realized that her talent did not exist in isolation. It was nurtured by her family, teachers, and the community that gave her opportunities to perform. She became aware of the responsibility her gift carried. Knowing that her music could affect others profoundly, this awareness fueled her dedication, pushing her to practice harder, to compose more thoughtfully, and to perform with sincerity. As she matured, she began mentoring younger students who showed an interest in music. She shared tips on technique, encouraged them to practice regularly, and reminded them of the joy music could bring. Teaching became another way to connect with her passion, allowing her to see the spark of excitement in others as they discovered their own abilities. She understood that music was not just about personal achievement. It was about community, growth, and inspiration. Her growing reputation began to open new doors. Invitations to perform at slightly larger venues became more frequent, and people started to recognize her in public spaces. While the attention was sometimes intimidating, it also brought a sense of validation. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the background. She had a presence, a voice, and a gift that others could no longer ignore. Yet she remained grounded, remembering her beginnings, the quiet hours spent alone at the piano, and the private moments of self-discovery that had shaped her. One day, a local cultural organization approached her with the opportunity to perform at a regional event. This was a bigger stage than she had ever imagined, with a larger audience, professional equipment, and the possibility of media coverage. The offer was both thrilling and frightening. The pressure felt immense, and she worried about making mistakes, disappointing herself or others, or failing to connect with such a large audience. But she knew that opportunities like this were rare, and she could not let fear stop her from taking the next step. In preparation, she dedicated weeks to practice, working on advanced compositions, perfecting her technique and building her stamina. She spent long evenings experimenting with expression, dynamics, and timing, exploring ways to make each note convey emotion. She reflected on her journey so far, remembering every performance, every struggle, and every moment when music had lifted her spirit. The preparation was grueling, but it strengthened not only her skills but also her confidence. She realized that growth often came from perseverance through difficulty, and that the journey itself was as important as the destination. When the day of the regional event arrived, she felt a mix of excitement, nervousness, and determination. The hall was filled with people she had never seen before, their anticipation palpable. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that the music was her ally, her voice, and her story. As she began to play, the audience fell silent, captivated by the emotion in each note. She could feel the energy of the room, the collective focus on her performance, and it fueled her further. Her fingers moved with confidence and grace, her heart pouring into every melody. For those moments, the world seemed to shrink to the space between her hands and the hearts of those listening. The performance was met with thunderous applause, cheers, and admiration. People approached her afterward, sharing how deeply the music had touched them, how it had evoked memories, feelings, and reflections they had long forgotten. She felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. The validation was not just in recognition, but in the knowledge that her music had genuinely affected lives. She understood then that every challenge, every doubt, every hour spent practicing alone had been leading to moments like this. Returning home after the event, she sat quietly at her piano, reflecting on the journey. She realized that her music had become more than a passion. It was her calling, her purpose, and her way to connect with the world. She understood that the path ahead would still be filled with obstacles, competition, and self-doubt, but she was ready to embrace it. She had learned that true growth required perseverance, humility, and dedication, and she knew that her music, born in quiet rooms and nurtured with love, could continue to inspire, comfort, and bring joy to those willing to listen. As she played into the night, experimenting with new melodies and revisiting old favorites, she felt a profound sense of peace. The piano had been her companion, her teacher, and her guide. It had been with her through quiet moments of doubt, nervous performances, small triumphs, and growing recognition. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she also knew that she was ready. Every note she played was a testament to her resilience, her passion, and the quiet strength that had carried her this far. And she felt certain that no matter where life took her, the music would continue to be her voice, her heart, and her path forward. As she continued to grow and develop as a musician, the girl began to receive invitations to perform on stages larger than anything she had imagined. These opportunities were exciting, but they also came with a new level of pressure. Each performance was a test of not just her skill, but her courage and emotional resilience. She faced moments of doubt, questioning whether she was ready or whether she could truly move an audience as she had hoped. But she also knew that every performance, every practice session, and every moment spent at the piano had prepared her for this. She took a deep breath, sat at the grand piano, and let the music flow from her heart. Her first major performance in a larger city was unforgettable. The hall was filled with strangers, and the size of the space was daunting. As she looked out at the sea of faces, her heart raced. She felt the weight of expectations, both her own and those of the people who had heard of her talent. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, everything else faded away. The music carried her, and she carried the music. Each note told a story. Each melody reached into the hearts of those listening, and time seemed to stop. For the audience, it was as if the music created its own world, one where they could forget their troubles, feel emotions deeply, and connect with something pure and beautiful. The applause at the end of her performance was overwhelming. People stood, clapping and cheering, some with tears in their eyes. She felt a mixture of relief, joy, and humility. It was a moment she had dreamed of, yet it surpassed anything she had imagined. The recognition she received was not about fame or attention. It was about connection. She realized that all the hours of practice, the moments of doubt, the sacrifices she had made, and the quiet nights alone at the piano had led her to this point. She had touched the hearts of others, and in doing so, she had found her own voice more fully than ever. Following this performance, her reputation grew. Invitations to play at different venues, cultural events, and charity gatherings became frequent. She was no longer just the shy girl from a small town. She was a young musician who had the power to inspire, comfort, and move people through her music. With each new opportunity, she felt both excitement and responsibility. She understood that her gift was not just for herself. It was something to be shared, something that could make the world a little brighter, a little more understanding, and a little more connected. As she continued performing, she faced new challenges. Traveling for concerts, adjusting to different pianos, and performing under varied conditions tested her adaptability and resilience. There were times when she felt exhausted, homesick, or overwhelmed, yet she kept going, driven by the knowledge that her music had purpose and meaning beyond herself. She discovered that the true strength of a musician lay not only in technical skill, but in the ability to convey emotion, connect with an audience, and persevere through difficulties. These lessons shaped her character, building confidence, patience, and grace. Her music also began to evolve. She experimented with composition, creating pieces that blended the technical skills she had learned with the emotion and imagination that had always driven her. Each composition became a reflection of her experiences, her growth, and her inner life. Friends, family, and teachers marveled at her creativity, but she remained humble, knowing that the journey of learning and discovery never truly ends. The joy came not just from recognition, but from the process itself, the endless exploration of sound, feeling, and expression. In addition to performing, she became more involved in mentoring younger students who were discovering their own passion for music. She shared her knowledge, her experiences, and her encouragement. She taught them not only techniques and compositions, but also the importance of patience, practice, and emotional honesty in music. Watching them grow, learning to express themselves and seeing the spark of excitement in their eyes reminded her of her own beginnings. She remembered how lonely it could feel to be a quiet girl with a gift that no one seemed to notice, and she wanted to make sure others could find their voices more easily. Her life was still full of ordinary responsibilities, challenges, and moments of doubt. There were times when she felt the weight of expectation pressing down, and there were days when progress seemed slow or imperceptible. Yet through it all, she had learned to trust in the music, in her talent, and in herself. She had discovered that persistence, passion, and dedication were just as important as natural ability. The music had become a constant source of strength, guiding her through uncertainty, shaping her growth, and offering solace in difficult times. Years of practice, dedication, and performances culminated in an opportunity to perform at a prestigious event, attended by people who had a deep appreciation for music. The hall was grand, the audience diverse, and the sense of anticipation palpable. She felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness, but she also felt ready. This was the moment to show not just her skill, but her soul. She took her place at the piano, closed her eyes, and let her fingers speak. The music flowed effortlessly, carrying emotion, story, and experience to every corner of the hall. The audience was captivated, listening with rapt attention, swept away by the melodies that seemed to come from somewhere larger than herself. The applause that followed was overwhelming. Filled with admiration, gratitude, and amazement, people approached her afterward, sharing how the music had touched them, how it had moved them to tears, laughter, or reflection. She realized then that all the struggles, sacrifices, and challenges had been worth it. Her music had power, impact, and meaning. It had connected her with others in ways she had never imagined. She felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose deeper than anything she had experienced before. Returning home after the performance, she sat at her piano once again. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The quiet beginnings, the long hours of practice, the moments of doubt, the first recognition in a small town, and the gradual growth into a confident, skilled musician. Each memory carried lessons, each struggle had shaped her character, and each performance had strengthened her resolve. She realized that music had given her a voice, a way to communicate her deepest emotions, and a means to connect with people in ways that words alone could never achieve. Her story became an inspiration to many in her community. Young musicians looked up to her, parents encouraged their children to follow her example, and people spoke of her performances with admiration. She became a symbol of perseverance, talent, and quiet determination, but she remained grounded, remembering the long hours spent alone at the piano, the nights of self-doubt, and the small steps that had brought her to this point. She understood that true success was not measured solely by recognition or applause, but by the dedication, growth, and joy that came from following one's passion. In the years that followed, she continued to perform, teach, and compose. She embraced every opportunity to share her music, to inspire others, and to continue learning herself. She understood that her journey was ongoing, that there would always be challenges, and that each new experience could offer growth, understanding, and connection. The piano remained her closest companion, her teacher, and her confidant, guiding her through life's ups and downs, offering solace, expression, and joy. Looking back, she realized that her path had been shaped by quiet determination, love for music, and the willingness to take risks despite fear. She had started as a shy girl in a small town, feeling invisible and uncertain. But through her dedication, passion, and courage, she had found her voice, touched countless hearts, and discovered the profound impact that music could have on herself and others. She had transformed not only her own life, but also the lives of those who listened to her. Every performance, every note, and every melody was a testament to her journey. It was proof that quiet determination, patience, and dedication could lead to extraordinary outcomes. She had learned that talent alone was not enough. It needed to be nurtured, shared, and expressed. She had discovered that music was more than sound. It was a bridge between souls, a healer of hearts, and a reflection of the human spirit. And in that realization, she found fulfillment, joy, and a sense of purpose that would guide her for the rest of her life. Even in moments of solitude, when the world was silent and the piano stood quietly in the corner, she felt the magic of her journey. She would sit down, Close her eyes and let her fingers tell the stories that words could not. And as the notes filled the room, she knew that she had truly found her place in the world, a place where her music could shine, where her heart could speak, and where time itself seemed to pause whenever her fingers touched the keys.